200 years ago, the land we now recognize as New York belonged to an entirely different world. Ultra-realistic cinematic wide shot of early 19th century New York Harbor before industrial modernization, rough coastal settlement surrounded by fog and dark Atlantic waters, muddy shoreline, scattered wooden structures, smoke drifting into the cold sky, bleak winter atmosphere, documentary photography style, soft gray dawn lighting. The towering skyline that today pierces the clouds did not exist. Street-level cinematic shot overlooking low wooden rooftops and church steeples instead of skyscrapers, empty gray sky above primitive harbor town, no modern buildings visible, cold wind moving through smoke and fog, muted color palette, atmospheric realism, wide lens composition emphasizing absence and emptiness, somber historical tone. There were no glowing skyscrapers made of steel and glass, no roaring highways packed with endless traffic, and no bright electric lights turning night into something that almost resembled day. Nighttime panoramic view of old New York completely lacking modern infrastructure, dark harbor streets illuminated only by scattered lanterns and candlelight, muddy roads without cars or highways, wooden homes disappearing into deep shadows, cinematic darkness, volumetric fog, realistic textures, emotionally heavy atmosphere, documentary film aesthetic. The New York of the early 19th century was quieter, darker, colder, and far more unforgiving than the modern city millions know today. Wide cinematic winter street scene in 1820s New York, exhausted workers walking through icy muddy roads between cramped wooden buildings, pale gray sky, smoke-filled air, harsh cold wind, dim natural lighting, gritty documentary realism, street-level perspective, bleak and unforgiving emotional tone. Back then, the city rested beside the harbor like a rough and unfinished settlement struggling to grow against nature itself. Aerial dockside view of unfinished early New York harbor settlement beside rough Atlantic waters, primitive wooden piers, muddy streets, scattered construction, workers battling harsh weather, storm clouds gathering overhead, cinematic wide shot, cold blue-gray lighting, historically authentic maritime atmosphere, resilient yet fragile mood. Wooden buildings stood tightly packed together along narrow streets covered in mud, dirt, and waste. Street-level close perspective through narrow muddy alleyways lined with crowded wooden buildings, overflowing waste, puddles reflecting dim daylight, dirty working-class residents in period clothing, textured timber walls, damp atmosphere, realistic grime and decay, cinematic documentary composition, oppressive mood. After heavy rain, the roads became nearly impossible to cross. Rain-soaked early New York street transformed into deep mud and standing water after a storm, pedestrians struggling to cross flooded roads, dark storm clouds overhead, cold wet atmosphere, ultra-detailed textures, low-angle cinematic shot, bleak survivalist mood. Wagon wheels sank, people walked carefully through puddles and slippery streets while icy wind moved between rows of crowded buildings. Street-level tracking shot of working-class pedestrians carefully stepping through icy puddles between crowded wooden buildings, coats whipping in freezing wind, lanterns flickering faintly, overcast afternoon light, realistic wet textures and harsh winter atmosphere, cinematic historical realism. The air itself felt heavy. Atmospheric close-up of smoke-filled New York streets under dense gray fog, chimneys pouring thick smoke into cold air, workers barely visible through haze, muted lighting, haunting documentary mood, cinematic environmental storytelling focused on suffocating atmosphere. Deep into thick mud while exhausted horses fought to pull heavy loads forward. Close-up cinematic dockside road scene of struggling horses pulling overloaded wooden wagons through deep mud, wagon wheels buried almost completely, exhausted animals breathing heavily in cold air, laborers pushing from behind, dramatic natural lighting, muddy textures, emotional realism, documentary style. Smoke drifted constantly from chimneys burning wood and coal. Wide shot of dozens of brick and wooden chimneys releasing black smoke over early industrial New York rooftops, coal fires glowing faintly inside homes and workshops, overcast winter sky, gritty textures, cinematic realism, smoky atmosphere dominating the city skyline. The smell of saltwater mixed with sweat, wet timber, animal waste, and the scent of the busy harbor. Busy 1820s harbor scene filled with dock workers unloading timber beside wet wooden piers, horses standing near muddy waste-covered streets, sea mist rolling through cargo docks, layered environmental storytelling, close cinematic framing, realistic textures and moisture, immersive sensory atmosphere. Everywhere, the sounds of labor filled the city from sunrise until long after sunset. Epic wide-angle documentary shot of laborers working across New York from dawn into evening, crowded docks, blacksmith workshops, wagons moving through muddy streets, glowing sunset through industrial smoke, cinematic time-spanning atmosphere, emotionally powerful depiction of relentless labor. Hammers struck metal. Close-up cinematic blacksmith workshop with sparks flying as a muscular blacksmith hammers glowing iron on an anvil, smoke-filled interior lit by furnace fire, sweat-covered face, dramatic orange lighting against dark shadows, highly textured realism, intense industrial mood. Workers shouted across crowded docks, dockside medium shot of rough harbor workers yelling commands while unloading cargo from wooden ships, ropes swinging overhead, crashing waves beside crowded piers, cold cloudy weather, gritty facial expressions, documentary realism, energetic chaotic atmosphere. Horses stomped against the muddy ground while wooden wagon wheels creaked through the streets. Low-angle cinematic street shot focused on muddy horse hooves stomping through wet roads beside creaking wooden wagon wheels, splashes of mud, crowded street background fading into smoke and fog, realistic sound implied motion, harsh winter lighting, immersive realism. And when night finally arrived, darkness consumed nearly everything. Nightfall over Old New York Harbor with streets vanishing into darkness, only faint lanterns visible through dense fog, silhouettes of wooden buildings and ships barely illuminated, cinematic wide shot, haunting shadows, emotionally unsettling atmosphere, ultra-realistic historical realism. Unlike the glowing modern skyline that now shines for miles, Old New York disappeared into shadows after sunset. Panoramic twilight view of 1820s New York fading into near-total darkness after sunset, no electric lights, only isolated candles visible in distant windows, black harbor waters reflecting faint moonlight, melancholic cinematic tone, immersive atmospheric realism. Homes were lit only by candles, lanterns, and weak oil lamps that flickered softly behind small windows. Close-up nighttime view of tiny wooden homes with warm candlelight flickering behind frost-covered windows, lanterns glowing softly inside cramped rooms, cold blue darkness outside, cinematic contrast lighting, emotionally intimate documentary realism. Outside, most streets became nearly black except for an occasional lantern hanging beside a doorway or carried by someone moving through the cold night. Street-level nighttime scene of nearly black early New York streets, lone figure carrying lantern through icy fog beside wooden buildings, isolated doorway lantern casting dim orange glow on muddy ground, cinematic suspenseful atmosphere, realistic cold weather textures. The silence of the evening felt unsettling. Empty nighttime alleyway in Old New York with silent fog-covered streets, distant lantern glow barely visible, abandoned muddy road between wooden buildings, cold moonlight, eerie cinematic framing, emotionally tense and unsettling mood. Only distant voices, barking dogs, crashing waves from the harbor, and the slow movement of horses could be heard through the darkness. Moody harbor night composition with shadowy horses moving slowly beside distant docks, barking dogs near alleyways, dark waves crashing against wooden piers, faint silhouettes in fog, documentary-style realism, cinematic sound-driven atmosphere. For many families, nighttime brought fear as much as rest. Interior candlelit scene of poor immigrant families sitting anxiously inside cramped wooden home at night, worried parents watching dark windows while children sleep nearby, flickering lantern light, emotional tension, realistic period clothing and textures, intimate cinematic framing. Crime, accidents, and deadly fires were constant dangers in a city built mostly from dry wood. Dark cinematic street scene showing dangerous early New York environment, wooden buildings packed tightly together, shadowy criminals in alleyways, damaged wagons, smoke rising from chimneys, ominous red glow suggesting fire danger, dramatic documentary realism. Fire terrified the people of Old New York. Emotional close-up of frightened 19th-century residents staring toward distant flames reflecting in their eyes, smoke filling the cold night air, terrified mothers clutching children, cinematic firelight and shadows, haunting historical realism. A single spark from a candle or chimney could spread across entire neighborhoods within minutes. Cinematic overhead shot of flames rapidly spreading across tightly packed wooden rooftops after a chimney spark ignites a building, thick black smoke consuming the neighborhood, chaotic panic below, dramatic orange firelight against dark night sky. Strong winds often carried flames from roof to roof while helpless residents rushed into the streets trying to save children, furniture, clothing, and food before everything disappeared. Wide cinematic disaster scene of desperate residents fleeing burning wooden homes during a wind-driven firestorm, families carrying children, blankets, chairs, and food into muddy streets, flying embers in freezing wind, emotionally devastating realism, documentary fire catastrophe atmosphere. Some families lost their homes overnight and had no choice but to start over with almost nothing. Somber dawn scene showing homeless immigrant families standing beside smoking ruins of burned wooden home, exhausted faces, ash-covered belongings scattered. Yet despite the hardship, New York was already becoming one of the most important ports in America. Epic harbor-wide shot of growing New York port filled with large sailing ships, busy docks, workers carrying cargo beneath cloudy skies, atmosphere of hardship mixed with ambition, cinematic historical realism, emotionally resilient mood. The harbor was the heart of the city. Grand aerial cinematic view centered on bustling New York harbor, ships crowding wooden piers, endless movement of sailors and workers, smoke drifting over waterfront businesses, golden sunrise lighting through fog, emotionally powerful maritime atmosphere. Massive wooden ships arrived from distant parts of the world carrying sugar, tea, cloth, tools, grain, lumber, and countless other goods. Dockside wide shot of enormous wooden merchant ships arriving from overseas, crews unloading barrels, sacks of grain, timber, and crates onto crowded piers, Atlantic fog and seagulls overhead, realistic maritime textures, cinematic documentary style. Sailors shouted commands while workers unloaded heavy cargo from dawn until evening. Dynamic cinematic harbor scene at sunrise with sailors yelling commands from ship decks while exhausted dock workers carry heavy cargo across wooden piers, golden light cutting through smoke and mist, gritty realism, immersive labor. The docks never truly rested. Time-lapse inspired cinematic waterfront scene showing continuous activity day and night at New York docks, lantern-lit workers beside ships under foggy skies, constant movement and labor, dramatic documentary mood, richly textured maritime realism. Waves crashed against wooden piers while ropes tightened, barrels rolled, and bells echoed across the waterfront. Low-angle dockside composition of crashing harbor waves beneath wet wooden piers, thick ropes pulled tight around ships, barrels rolling across muddy docks, harbor bells ringing in misty air, cinematic realism with detailed maritime textures. For newcomers arriving by ship, New York represented hope. Emotional cinematic shot of immigrant families standing on crowded ship deck approaching early New York harbor for the first time, hopeful yet exhausted faces, gray morning fog, distant wooden city skyline ahead, documentary realism filled with fragile optimism. Immigrants from Ireland, Germany, England, and many other European countries crossed dangerous oceans searching for a better life. Wide cinematic ocean voyage scene showing crowded immigrant ship crossing rough Atlantic waters, diverse European families in worn clothing enduring harsh weather on deck, storm clouds overhead, emotionally resilient atmosphere, ultra-realistic historical detail. Many escaped hunger, war, poverty, or political hardship in their homelands. Symbolic cinematic composition of weary immigrants carrying emotional scars of famine and war, gaunt faces, worn coats, tired children clutching belongings aboard ship, cold desaturated lighting, haunting documentary realism emphasizing suffering and survival. They arrived carrying small bags, worn clothing, and dreams of survival. Dockside medium shot of immigrant families stepping onto muddy New York piers carrying tiny cloth bags. Some hope to open businesses. Inspirational close-up of ambitious immigrant man standing beside crowded Market Street imagining a future storefront, rough hands gripping small ledger book, early morning light through smoke-filled streets, hopeful documentary atmosphere. Others simply prayed for work, food, and shelter. Somber nighttime scene of exhausted immigrant family huddled beside harbor warehouse praying quietly for survival, weak lantern light illuminating tired faces, cold fog surrounding them, emotionally intimate cinematic realism. But the city they entered was far from easy. Wide shot of overwhelming early New York streets crowded with mud, smoke, shouting workers, overloaded wagons, and harsh weather, newly arrived immigrants staring in shock, oppressive cinematic atmosphere, gritty documentary realism. Most immigrants quickly discovered that life in New York demanded relentless labor. Montage-style cinematic composition of immigrant laborers performing exhausting work across docks, streets, and workshops from dawn until dusk, sweat-covered faces, gray industrial atmosphere, emotionally intense realism, documentary tone. Men worked long exhausting hours loading cargo, repairing ships, cutting wood, building roads, or working inside crowded workshops and factories. Epic industrial-era labor scene featuring men unloading cargo, sawing timber, repairing ships, and constructing muddy roads simultaneously, smoke-filled workshops in background, harsh natural lighting, cinematic wide-angle realism packed with historical detail. Their hands became rough and scarred from years of physical labor. Extreme close-up of weathered worker hands covered in scars, dirt, splinters, and calluses, gripping rough rope beside harbor dock, drama. Bags and battered suitcases, worn boots and torn coats, hopeful yet fearful expressions, foggy harbor background, emotional cinematic realism. Atmosphere. Covered in mud, cold gray morning light, emotionally heartbreaking documentary realism, cinematic composition emphasizing loss.